Well, let me just say preliminarily to everyone here, this is one of the smoothest run conferences I've ever been in, and it looks like it's easy, and the easier it looks, the harder it was to put together. And so I think all of us are grateful for how well this has gone. Let me just say preliminarily, when I told a friend of mine who had been the general counsel of the 3 Mile Island investigation of the nuclear disaster, he said, let me tell you, when he heard I was going to talk about the economy and the rule of law, what he was told by this friend of his. It goes something like this. It said, William, let me suggest something. All you know about nuclear energy could fit in the navel of a flea and still leave room for a half a peanut and a teacher's salary. And that's where I am right now, but I think we can do a little better. I'd like to start off with something which, in fact, I end with, really. And it's not very complicated. But with what I have been doing for the last 6 or 7 years in the Middle East leads me to the following proposition, that people who have nothing to lose. And that is what the economy and the growth of economy and the rule of law is all about. I want to address some of the things that I think can make a difference in terms of the opportunity that is necessary for people to feed their families, to have shelter, to have medical aid when necessary, and most important, to have hope that there is a future of opportunity to make a good living and to be able to share what people want to share in the terms of loving and affection within a family unit. I would like to talk a little bit about where we are. We talk a great deal, and I've listened to it carefully today, about the application of the rule of law, the difficulties of how much it really has made a change and a difference in reliability, openness, honesty, and that kind of thing. I want to expand that somewhat and talk a little bit about the world in which Turkey lives. It is not an island unto itself. It's part of the world and part of the world economy. And in that regard, it is very much necessarily involved with what's going on both below it geographically, to the west and to the east. And I want to mention just a few things about the Middle East and North Africa, where I've been involved for some time. The population in this area, and please listen to these figures, they come from the World Bank and from the IFC and other institutions. Within 15 years, there will be a need for 50 million jobs in the so-called MENA area, and that's the Middle East and North Africa. Over 65% of those 50 million jobs will be needed for young people under the age of 32. Where is that coming from? I don't know. And what it leads to is that the educational system around not just Turkey, not just the Middle East or North Africa, but the entire world is going to have to face up to that. Because without the future of jobs, without a hope that there is something for them and their families and for the institutions in which they want to work and the state in which they live, we're going to end up with instability, violence, and we've already seen it. You combine that with the social media. I know that's a major problem here, but if you look at what happened on Tahrir Square in Egypt and in Tunisia, where we are working, which started the Arab Awakening or Arab Spring, that is a reflection of despair. What do young people do when they can't get jobs? What can you do when you grow up in a community like Palestine in the West Bank, which is probably the most educated Arab unit in the world, and you can't get a job, and you can't leave without permits and return? This is serious stuff, and we are not facing it. You could talk about order, rule of law, reliability, but you have to face what we are facing. How did the Arab Awakening or Arab Spring catch on so quickly? It wasn't just tweet or the other social media. I think there are a few of them now. It's growing exponentially. But what is going to be needed is to try to figure out, and we have not done so, what is the type of education, vocational or other? It makes no difference. And there is a new system found in Germany, which we're using in Tunisia right now, which is a software which helps to bring together the markets that need employment, what kind of employment, and then we try, it does it itself once we feed it in adequately and tells us who may be available and what could be done to provide jobs. I think it's going to work. It's brand new. So far, we've been lucky about it, and it's really makes a difference. There are two things I want to just talk about briefly, and I'm going to be quite short. I'm older than dirt. And way back in about 1963, I was director of the United States Commission on Civil Rights under President Kennedy. And one day I got a call and said, we would like, from the State Department, saying we would like you and Judge Thurgood Marshall to go to East Africa, because we're going to try to form an economic unit of East Africa. And we want you to try to talk to the people, the young people in that whole area, Uganda, then Kenya, and Tanganyika at the time, in Zanzibar. Well, we went over there, and those who didn't know Thurgood Marshall have to understand, he was not yet on the Supreme Court, but he went there later. But he was a very powerful and fun individual. He was not dour, he was not... but he was articulate, and he cared. Well, we went there, flew all night, and he kept telling me, when we get to the airport, Jomo Kenyatta, who was the fellow who ran the Mau Mau and was then prime minister and was running Kenya, we went to a dinner at his house, and this is relevant. It was a surprise to me. And he was still judge. Thurgood was talking to Kenyatta, and he said, you know, it was Jomo, I spent 7 miserable weeks with you in London writing your new Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I'm disappointed in you. This afternoon, I rode around Nairobi, and I saw 7 stores owned by Indians for sale, and I know that you took those, or your people took them. And I find that offensive, to which Kenyatta said, Judge Marshall, I'm going to do something about it. To which the one and only Thurgood said, no, I don't want you to tell me you're going to do something about it. Tell me how you're going to do it and give me a time period. Well, I was kind of astounded. The rest of the evening went on like that, and I have to say, on the way back to the General Counsel's home, I said something like, and those of you who may have read this, I said, you know, I've been thinking about this. They're going to want to say something to you. And he said, what? I said, you know, your behavior with the new government and with the new prime minister, and I stopped for a second. I said, reminds me of the Emperor Jones. And there was silence for a second. He said, White boy, when we're in East Africa, I am the Emperor Jones. So that was the good fun. But what I wanted to tell you was that he went into a speech about if property is not sacred, if it is not written and protected, if you can't get real title to property, you don't have any rights. And I don't care whether you think that the only thing that counts is whether or not you have free speech, you have this or that. He said, at the core, the most sacred thing that people have is their ownership of property. Well, it just astounded me that occurred. That's one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there are going to have to be new ways in which we deal with developing countries and the needs. It's no longer government. It's going to have to be public-private partnerships. I believe this deeply, and I want to tell you about the one that I chair right now and how it's gone and how it came about. At the Aspen Institute for maybe 2 or 3 years, we had constant arguments about what we could do to reduce the potential for conflagration in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians. And it was talk, and everybody was getting a little tired of it. We'd heard it all before. We were pessimistic about it. And we convened a meeting of people who were much involved and caring. And 4 people in particular came together. And it was Madeleine Albright, who had been our prior Secretary of State. It was Henry Kissinger, who had been Secretary of State. And it had been Chuck Hagel, who was then a senator from Nebraska, and Senator Feinstein of California, who is now head of the Intelligence Committee. And we spent 2 days talking about what we could do. I unfortunately came into the right room at the wrong time, and I got commandeered. But what finally happened was that we got together with OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and said, would they help us to regenerate the economy in Palestine? The theory being that if there is stability in the economy and people are feeling there's a future, that would reduce the potential for violence. And so we worked out the following, that OPIC would guarantee loans that we would make through the banks, but we would select what targets, what kinds of markets we wanted to deal with, and the banks would make the loans, OPIC would guarantee it, and the idea was to get credit in the market so that people were in a position to either start businesses or expand businesses. It was so-called, we call it LGF, Long-Term Guarantee Facility, but it was, and it remains, something where we could look at the needs, gauge the needs, and we could do it on a private basis, work it through the banks, and then we did something which we called the necessary money to train the banks to get away from collateral as the only way to get funding for the operation. And we have had a remarkable run. At this point, less than 7 years from when we started, we have now been enabled to invest $117 million in the West Bank. Our default rate is just slightly over 2%. And you think that's good, right? So we got criticized because we didn't take enough risk. But the one thing that is a problem under any rule of law anywhere is the recognition that the worst situations occur against women, not just in the West Bank. I don't know the situation in Turkey, but I sure know North Africa and the Middle East. And it's all over the world. And I think there's got to be a recalibration of what needs to be done. Let me give you an example. We determined that it would be important that some of our investments had to go to women. And so we gave loaned $500,000 to a group of women who came to see us about it and said they wanted to start a store. They had all of it laid out. And it would be 100% owned by the women and run by the women. And it took off almost right away. And we liked it so much, we did another building and another program for $1 million, and it's the same. The difference has been remarkable. As a result of that, for example, 2 young women came in to see us and said, we want to open up an optometry store, and both for medical purposes and for selling eyeglasses and that kind of thing. That came about because they heard about what was done with the 2 buildings and the 2 new programs that we had set up with the women. That disproportionate emphasis is continuing, and I think we're making a difference. We had trouble at the start. It was not culturally favorable, but it's working out well. And now 1 or 2 of the colleges in the West Bank and 1 of them in Tunisia are asking to have training facilities for women. The other part of that is that we took a look at some of the projects that we had already invested in and said, we won't give you more money unless you set up an educational program for the women to be able to move from menial jobs into your situation. In one case, it was a small hotel, to train them to use the computers for reservations and for advertising and other things. It's beginning to work. It's not easy. But this is something that I think everybody up here, you in particular, I think have to look at and say, how do we get this message across? The United States is way ahead, but still not where it ought to be. But in these other countries, it is exceedingly difficult. I hope we will continue to be able to do that, but it's a worldwide problem which has been widely ignored. We can talk about it, what needs to be done as far as the rule of law is concerned, but the rule of law clearly embraces the need for women to be in a competitive position and to be given the opportunity to succeed. Because I really believe that without that kind of thing, there is never going to be stability. Now, one of the other things that is important that I want to talk about very briefly is people have said, why should we come in to these areas where there's such a high risk? And it's not just in the Middle East or North Africa, it's here, it's everywhere. What business people want is reliability. They want to know what they're being told. They're being told is the truth. They can rely on it, they will take the risk, and they will invest. But unless it's open, transparent, and clear to them, they're not going to invest. We've had any number of people, for example, in Tunisia, we're also doing a kind of a franchising operation, which is a little different than we've done before. That's the biggest issue we have. How will we be protected? How are the risks going to be handled? And will we be getting the facts? And so a disproportionate effort has been to tell the people in these countries where we're now operating, and it's now spreading into Morocco and other things. We're quite busy. And it's Turkey as well. It's in every country. Business people are prepared to invest in new things, but they need partners, they need honesty, they need openness, and that's where the rule of law really is applicable. And I also want to say that it's not just heavy duty, it's huge opportunity for the business people, for professionals, to realize how many people, young people with energy, brains, and training, will be benefited if we all get together and help. And people need help. I could say more than this about the population figures. I mean, we're going to be at 9.5 billion people on this earth. 1.5 billion more, at least the projections are, before the end of this century. What are we going to do with that? The unemployment rate in this whole area right now is 46%, if you count the North African area. It's 13%, I guess, here. You know it better than I do. But this is both a huge economic challenge. It's going to require a differing form and a more imaginative form of education, and it's going to require hands-on training of people who have never done this kind of thing before. We have had amazing success with the 8 or 9 banks we're working with, for example, in the West Bank, by we have 14 people now working there, all Palestinian, half women, half men. And they go around bank to bank now and train the banking officers how to invest on a cash flow basis, not collateral. I'll tell you why there's no money in these places. It's collateral borrowing. You've been through it more than I have. You want to borrow $100, you put up $200 for collateral. Now that doesn't generate a lot of business, but that's the way it's always been. And it's begun to change, and it has changed there. The banks are accepting it, and I think we've got a long way to go, but it's working. I don't want to speak anymore because I want people who know what they're talking about to speak. And I really appreciate being able to participate in this, because this is our future. This really is an opportunity. High risk, high return, indispensable for stability and peace. And if we don't grab it now, when we're right on the cusp of change, we're making a terrible mistake. You're on. This woman is the queen of the World Bank in Turkey, Marina West, and we're delighted you're here, and thank you. And she's going to put some things up which will make more sense than I have. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think those stories and those examples you gave make things come to life. So I want to very sincerely thank the organizers for asking me to attend today's and tomorrow's event. I'm an economist, and I have learned so much today. It's really been one of the most interesting days I've had in a very long time, to be introduced to so many ideas that are really relevant to also what I do. So I want to take not too much of your time, because I know it's late in the day and there is a beautiful city on the other side of these walls, although I think it is going to rain soon. But I won't take too much of your time. I want to bring across a couple of key ideas where I think economics and the rule of law institutions more broadly, where they interconnect. I will also use a number of charts to illustrate those ideas. Now, as an economist, I work with charts days in, days out, and to me, they illustrate things. They make things clearer. If to you they confuse you, don't worry about it, because I will say what is in those charts. So it's really your own personal preference. Okay, so 3 ideas, 3 main hypotheses that I would like to get across today. And I will elaborate on each of these 3. The first one is that cross-country economic institutions play a key role in a country's growth potential. So we can show that indeed there is a link between the quality of institutions and growth. The second idea is that Turkey has made a lot of progress in building institutions, but at the same time, there's more that can be done. So it's a glass half full, a glass half empty. And the third idea, and this is maybe the one where I will spend most of my time on, is that from an economic perspective, Turkey is now at a critical juncture. What we see is that when countries reach an income level on a per capita basis of about $10,000 to $12,000, and this is where Turkey is, that it becomes much harder to sustain growth. Sometimes it's called the middle income trap. And I want to link that to the institutional agenda, to the institutional reform agenda, how Turkey can escape the middle income trap going forward. So that's the third idea. Okay. This chart, if you are so inclined to look at it carefully, actually what it shows is that economic institutions play a key role in growth, okay? It's a bit difficult for my colleagues on the panel to see. So countries with a stronger institutional environment, effective rule of law, a good business climate, more secure property rights, they are better positioned to attract investment, to participate in trade, and to utilize the physical and human capital that they have, to utilize that more effectively. So in my presentation, I will be using, and I'll just say it now so that I don't have to keep on coming back to it. I'll be using a couple of different data sources. Some of them are from the World Bank. The World Bank produces worldwide governance indicators, drawing on indicators from other institutions. We also have doing business indicators, which look at the business environment. But I'm also using indicators from different sources, including the Heritage Foundation, the Corruption Perception Index. So there's a range of indices that are used in this presentation. But this first chart shows that in generally, countries with a higher per capita income have better institutions, and countries with a lower per capita income have worse institutions. What we see here, and please take my word for it, is that we have different institutional indices. So the red dots are rule of law, the blue ones are control of corruption indices, the green ones are government effectiveness, the purple is regulatory quality, and the orange is ease of doing business. But what we see is generally across countries, there's a high correlation between the different governance indicators. So a country that has a good score on, say, control of corruption also tends to have a good score on regulatory quality, on ease of doing business. There is a correlation in those scores. Of course, there are exceptions, but in general, we see a high degree of correlation between the different measures of institutions and rule of law. Okay, so then turning to Turkey specifically and zooming in on doing business. I've just suggested that a lot of the indicators are correlated, so I'm going to zoom in on doing business because I think it is most directly relevant to the economic growth and the economic performance agenda. And what doing business does is that the World Bank produces a doing business rating for each of 189 countries, and the rating measures the environment in which businesses operate. So it looks at things like how easy is it to start a business, to get electricity, to register property, to get credit, to protect investors, to enforce contracts, and to resolve insolvency, okay? So country one, which I think is Singapore, is the highest ranked, and country 189, which I would have to look up, is the lowest ranked. Turkey ranks 69, okay, which is not bad. Azerbaijan is 70, just to give you an idea. Greece is 72. South Africa is 41. And Mexico is 53. So it's very much a middle-income country kind of score. And Turkey, so Turkey has made progress on that doing business agenda, but still, it still has a large agenda ahead of it, which in a way is good, because it means that it can find sources for further growth going forward. Okay. So, I started by saying that at countries that have more or less Turkey's income level, $10,000 to $12,000 per capita GDP, we find that institutions, including the rule of law, really begin to matter to growth. What we see is that once countries have reached about $10,000 per capita, the convergence and the growth starts to stagnate, and there is a much higher frequency of growth slowdowns. It becomes much more difficult to grow, and there's only few countries that have made it over the past 40 years, that's what this chart illustrates, from lower and middle income to high income. One of the countries that's made it is South Korea. It's probably the most famous example of a country that has made it, and a country to which Turkey often looks in many areas, at least on the economic front. And then there's a number of countries, some of them now part of the EU, but all of them near the EU, that have also managed to break through this middle income trap. But Turkey, as you can see, being in that square in the middle, has not quite made it yet to high income status. Now, I have been saying that the rule of law and institutions matter more when countries grow richer, and that they are important to sustaining growth. So maybe one broad hypothesis, and then just a few more words about Turkey as to why I'm saying that. So one hypothesis is that when countries are at lower income levels, the investment strategy and the growth strategy relies on imitation, okay? But then when you start becoming richer, to continue growing, you really need to innovate. And if you as an economy want to innovate rather than just imitate, you need secure property rights to invest in land, in property, and intellectual property rights. So these institutional and rule of law issues, as an economy moves to more innovation-based growth, they become much more important. Now, what we've seen in Turkey, and Turkey, for those of you that don't know Turkey that well, Turkey has had a very good growth record, especially since 2001. It has grown on average twice as quickly as the European Union. It has had a very good growth record, and that growth record has been linked to structural change. Turkey has also been one of the most rapidly urbanizing countries in the world. So what we've seen people moving from rural areas to urban areas. We've seen people moving out of agriculture into services, into manufacturing. And in that context, productivity of the average worker went up because of this rapid structural change, the growth, the movement out of agriculture into cities. There may be a bit of further potential for this growth model to generate further growth. But going forward, Turkey needs a different growth model. And as part of that growth model, to sustain productivity growth, to create jobs, continued institutional reform has to be critical. Now, I can say just a few words about what we see as some of the big economic challenges right now. And I will list some of them, but they're closely interlinked, right? So if I say attracting FDI, deepening capital markets, institutions are part of that, right? The jobs agenda, the labor market agenda, is a particularly important one. I was talking to some colleagues over one of the coffee breaks, and you wouldn't believe it if you look around this room, but the female labor force participation rate in Turkey is extremely low. It's lower than in many MENA countries. So bringing that potential, bringing women into the labor market, including by offering better childcare opportunities and more affordable childcare opportunities, by offering flexible contracting in employment contracts, all these policy measures will help to bring about greater female labor force participation. So the institutional reform agenda complements the other policy agendas, and it's a critical one. Turkey has done a lot, but it will need to do more if it wants to make it to high income. That's my message.
Great. Great. Come on, Juergen. Thank you. It's great.
How much time did I take?
No,
How much time?
great. Wonderful. Okay. You're
I was within my time.
Juergen, you probably read about him, but he is both a state judge and the Hessian Administrative Court. He's written books, articles. He's an expert on investigations and on corruption, may be corrupt, I don't know, and all kinds of things. But he is someone that I think we really need to hear in terms of the impact of violations of rule of law on the economy and how it impedes its growth. Your Honor.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very proud being here, speaking at that conference, and I want to join my co-speakers in congratulating the organizers in making that conference. I think it's the right conference with the right topics at the right time, at the right place, and I wish that the conference deserves the attention it needs. I have been asked to speak about the impact of the rule of law on business and economy. And in my main profession, I'm a lawyer advising companies, and I want to shed some light from a practical company perspective on that topic. I want to speak with you first about the legal framework, the worldwide anti-corruption legislation we have today. Then I want to speak with you about the obligation worldwide operating companies have, what they have to observe, how that fits into the compliance program. And then I will conclude how the rule of law could support a compliance culture or could prevent companies from doing business. So from a micro perspective, I think I will shed some light on what Marina showed with very impressive figures here. So the legal framework, over the last 20 years, our whole legal system in anti-corruption laws have completely changed. I have taken anti-corruption laws as one segment of compliance because I think it's a good example to demonstrate how it impacts the business. So 20 years ago, there was only the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States. He made it a punishable offense to bribe public officials abroad, and there were also some bookkeeping provision. There was no international standard on fighting corruption. In 1997, the OECD issued a convention combating bribery. That was implemented then in the following years within all 52 member states of the OECD, and in addition in 6 other countries. I'll come in a minute to the obligation which have been imposed by the OECD Convention combating bribery. The next move was on the European level. We had significant efforts on the EU level to combat bribery. Helena mentioned some very important steps to go there. So basically, from the European angle, a lot of activities have been undertaken in order to fight corruption. That was extended then in the first 5 years of the 2000s with bribery in the private sector. We have now a nearly European wide network of countries where bribery in the private sector is a punishable offense. So what is all that about the basic topics of the OECD Convention combating bribery, of the European legislation? The basic topics are: it is a punishable offense to bribe a public official abroad. All countries, in all countries, bribery is a punishable offense within the company in all civilized countries. OECD Convention, that was a new move forward to say it must be a punishable offense to bribe public officials abroad. The second thing was to make it a punishable offense to pay bribes in the private sector within the country and abroad. All EU member states, all member states of the OECD Convention have to ensure that bribes may not be tax deducted and that it is a punishable offense if bribes are treated as tax deductible offenses. In addition, the member states have to ensure that corporations are liable if their employees bribe people. That means either a liability under criminal law or under an administrative fine. In most countries, the sanction is a criminal sanction imposed on corporations. In other countries, it's an administrative fine. For example, Germany, we do not know the concept of sanctioning companies. It's an administrative fine, like driving too quick on the Autobahn. However, money is money. Just to give you an example, Siemens paid nearly 600 million euro as an administrative fine for not having a functioning compliance program. The criminal fine in the US was much lower. It was $450,000. So it's a question of label, whether you call it administrative fine or whether you call it criminal sanction. But at the end of the day, it has really a big impact. The next obligation, and this is an example, an excellent example, how you can make anti-bribery laws really effective. That was that the member states of the OECD and on the EU level have to oblige tax authorities and prosecutors to inform each other if there is suspicion of bribery. And looking back over the last 15 years, this obligation has made it really effective, the fight against corruption, because sooner or later every company has a tax audit. Tax auditors look into the books and records of the corporations, And if they find suspicion that bribes have been paid, they have to inform the public prosecutor. Vice versa, also if the public prosecutor comes across suspicion, he has to inform the tax authorities. A practical effect is if such a notice is been made, a tax audit takes place and then potentially reveals other bribery payment. One of the most important obligation on the company side is that they are legally bound by law to have an established compliance program in order to supervise employees and to ensure that employees do not violate the law. So let's switch now to the company side. All international operating companies have an obligation to have a functioning compliance program. And the goal is that there should be no bribery in the public or in the private sector, that there should be no tax evasion. This is a very serious obligation. Again, the example of Siemens. Siemens paid this 600 million euro not because employees had paid bribes. Siemens paid 600 million euro in Germany because they had not have an effective compliance program. That was a basis for sanctioning the company. That was within Europe, I think, a wake-up call because companies see it can expose them to really significant financial risks. Another obligation is that part of a functioning compliance program is to investigate potential wrongdoing. Under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it is one very important obligation. In the European jurisdictions, we do not have such a strict concept. However, there are other legal grounds which may force a corporation to investigate, for example, tax obligations or corporate governance aspects. And the third point is that companies have reporting obligation vis-à-vis the authorities that may also differ in different countries. My practical experience is if you have a reporting obligation in one country, then you would report it also in the other country affected because you know that the corporation internationally, the authorities internationally exchange information, and you know if one day the investigating authority in one country has an information, it will be given also to the other country. So why do international operating companies comply with this obligation and undertake these tremendous compliance efforts? So first, it is a protection of assets. If you ensure that your employees are in compliance with the law, you protect your assets. No sanctions, then your assets are still there. You protect the business. It's a reputational aspect, of course. And again, if you look at companies who are vigorously investigated for corruption, Siemens was such a company. They have problems on various levels, and one really significant problem is that they cannot hire people because young people coming from the university, they do not want to work for an employer who is under heavy investigation for corruption. They want to be proud within their families and say, I work for a compliant company. Compliance is protection of profits, of lawful profits, and of course, in a wider sense, it protects the families, the business partners, If you have seen a corporation who have been barred from business, let's say if the World Bank imposes a sanction and a corporation is barred from World Bank business, that has impact also on other business. And if the company has no business, then the employees will lose their jobs, and that will have impacts also on the family. So let me now switch to the question in how far the rule of law supports a compliance culture. What we expect today from companies is a tone from the top compliance culture. That means we want that this is effective within the company. And such a compliance system, the implementation of such a compliance system is much easier if you have a clear legal system, an environment with a clear legal system, where you know what the applicable laws are. It's what Marina showed on a very high level. You have a bribery-free administration. You know what the applicable law is, and you know that the rules are applied. You have independent courts where you could seek remedial actions if you think that the administration is not applying the law as they should be. There is a checks and balances between the powers within the states. You have the possibility to refrain from paying bribes. And an important thing for most international operating companies, you have the possibility to investigate potential wrongdoing. This is very important if you come across irregularities, that you look into it and that you have the possibility to find out, is there a problem? If yes, stop it, identify it, fix it, and then continue business. Insofar, I would like to say that compliance and the rule of law are, to a certain extent, sisters. They are two sides of the same medal. The strict application of the rule of law allows and encourages a real compliance culture. Now, let's look on the other side. Why do companies and investors leave countries or stay away from countries where the rule of law is not applied? I touched some topics which have been discussed already today. I make that very short. So if companies have to pay bribe, they endanger their business, at least in two jurisdictions, in the two jurisdictions where they are asked to pay bribes and in their home jurisdictions. This is the international anti-bribery laws. They create really big, huge reputational risks. They face investigations and penalties in two countries. And what is extremely important, in countries where the state of law is not applied, you may not investigate possible wrongdoing. That means you may not fix any problems which could come up. So I come to the end, and I want to emphasize why I think that the rule of law is extremely important for the business and has huge impact on the business. Companies, corporations, investors, they want countries with predictable laws. They want independent judges. They want public prosecutors who are bound by the law. They want independent lawyers free from state control in order to get legal advice. And they want a stable legal system which really allows them to make business decision and then to stay with this business decision without any impact from administration. I thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't talk too long.
No, you didn't. And now we're coming to the end of this one. Christina, you probably already met, but this is the UN Global Pact, okay?
Global Compact, yep.
What? Yes.
Yeah, you got it.
I think so. And she's got a number of slides. Are they up there yet? Yeah. This is a very, very interesting, to me, potential for making an actual, realistic difference in terms of commitments from both lawyers and corporations and businesses to become active participants in filling the role of the creation of jobs and helping to stabilize not just Turkey, but Turkey's surroundings and the world. And I congratulate you on it, so thanks.
Thank you, Berl. Thanks. And welcome, everybody. And again, I echo everyone's sentiment today about thanking the organisers for inviting the UN Global Compact to present at this important event. And I feel very privileged to be speaking on behalf of the Global Compact about business support for the rule of law at such an important time in front of such important people. To make sure, it's been a long day, I'm sure, and just to make sure, I can see everyone's awake, but I want to make sure that you're alert. So I'm going to ask you a question. I'd like you to raise your hands if you have heard of the UN Global Compact before. Please raise your hands. That's a terrible, terrible answer. That was a trick question because Professor Juergen just opened this morning about the Global Compact, so I thought so many more people would raise their hands. But it means I have some work to do, so thank you. It's great. I also actually want to thank the previous panellists because I think that, and also my fellow panellists, because I think they really did set the scene for the topics that I'd like to discuss today. And it really is about raising awareness about the UN Global Compact and its efforts to promote collaboration between states, the private sector, NGOs, academia and other actors at the global and the local level, which is important to also highlight. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what I'd like to talk to, so give you some background about what the UN Global Compact is, what its vision is, and also its objectives about how it wants to achieve that vision. I'll also go through just very briefly about the business case. So why do businesses engage with the Global Compact? Then I'll feed into the importance of strengthening the relationship between the states and business through what is called the post-2015 agenda, and I would not be surprised if none of you have heard of that concept, and we'll certainly explain that in more detail. And how one of the key issues from the post-2015 agenda is about promoting good governance and how that can be achieved through anti-corruption and business for the rule of law. I'll also go through just a few examples of how business is already supporting the rule of law and highlighting, as Berl foreshadowed as well, about the importance of the legal profession in supporting business to do good business, and finally give you some insights on how to get involved. Okay, so the Global Compact was really the vision of then Secretary-General Kofi Annan back in 2000 and was established by the General Assembly on the 26th of July of the same year. The Global Compact today has over 12,000 participants. 8,000 of those are companies and small to medium enterprises, or SMEs. And we also have around 100 local networks, and of course one of which is the very active local network here in Turkey. And it makes us actually the world's largest corporate sustainability platform and multi-stakeholder collective action platform. So what does actual corporate sustainability mean? So the Global Compact refers to corporate sustainability as a company's creation of long-term value in financial, in social, environmental and ethical terms. And it's important to highlight that, and Georg Kell, our Executive Director, is very passionate about highlighting the point that we need to emphasise the importance of the financial aspect, because if business don't see the value in doing this, then of course it's going to be very difficult for them to get engaged. And there is definitely a business case for doing so. And businesses are able to join the Global Compact by pledging their commitment to the 10 principles. Oops, which I've read there as well. So, and they're really covering 4 key areas. So we have human rights, labour, environment and anti-corruption. And the Global Compact's 10 principles are grounded in universal standards, and they include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Labour Organization Declaration on the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, and the UN Convention Against Corruption. So effectively, the UN Global Compact's vision is a more sustainable and inclusive economy. And how we propose to do that is when companies sign up and other small to medium enterprises, etc., when they sign up to the Global Compact, we hope to instill in them 2 core obligations. The first being to respect, and by that we mean do no harm, the baseline, the minimum standard, and that also obviously incorporates compliance into a business's culture, strategy, operations and relationships. And interestingly, that also includes the recently endorsed UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That was actually endorsed by the Human Rights Council in 2011, and again, it goes to those international norms. And the second one is around support. So the support of UN goals and issues, including the Millennium Development Goals. And interestingly, this touches on Professor Juergen's point earlier today about the whole concept of soft law and how important it is for us to be able to promote collaboration. So, as I mentioned before, begs the question, what's in it for business? As you know, unfortunately with most things, we say, what's in it for me? And so, as you can see here, there are 3 key areas where we say that there is a benefit to business. The first and most fundamental is the concept of do no harm, which is risk management. So looking at operational and regulatory risk, which includes compliance, reputational risk, supply chain risk. Then we're looking at the more proactive, so the support areas around productivity and growth, which look at how we can look at operational efficiencies and explore new markets and geographies, also creating new labour markets and also having new consumers and market share. So how do we propose to strengthen the relationship between states and business? Well, the UN system has been engaged with the private sector in various ways in the past, but the UN Global Compact is the primary platform for facilitating dialogue between the UN system and the private sector in exploring how enlightened global business can support what is commonly known in UN circles as the post-2015 agenda. Now, some of you may be aware that the UN's Millennium Development Goals are due to expire in 2015. And for those of you that don't know what the MDGs are, they are a collective action to work towards the elimination of poverty, promotion of universal education, looking at gender equality, child mortality, looking at maternal health, addressing HIV, malaria, environmental and other developmental issues. So, as we speak now, the UN's member states, some 197 countries from varying levels of economic development, are working towards the next phase of the MDGs. And as I've stated, they are what's called the post-2015 agenda. And so there's a growing shift, as Berl mentioned as well, about the move towards public-private partnerships and the importance of that. And there being a greater need for greater collaboration with the private sector in that regard. And as such, the Global Compact has facilitated a global consultation process which resulted in the Building Post-2015 Business Engagement Agenda, which was actually launched, the picture right there, of now Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon at our Leaders Summit, which is a triennial event that was held in September last year, and just reinforces the message and the importance of the role of business in advancing these issues.
Could I interrupt you? May I? Just a moment.
Sure.
people here would be, and probably are concerned, how in Turkey would there be a benefit to either the professions, the corporations, or anyone else living here in a very practical way for becoming involved with the compact? What would they do? What would they get out of it? Would there be new jobs created? Would there be new housing created? What would happen? New credits available? What could they do?
In terms of, I guess you're probably stealing my thunder a little bit in terms of later piece of the presentation, but I think it's really important in terms of the function of the Global Compact is really about trying to promote dialogue. So the interests of business in engagement with the Global Compact and member states too, let's make that very clear, is that we're trying to promote dialogue. And what they actually receive by participating is having an opportunity, and we hope to think a safe space for them to actually talk about how they can advance corporate sustainability issues. Interestingly, and that's globally, but also relevant to Turkey as well, in terms of the fact that businesses and small to medium enterprises are grappling with how they deal with corporate sustainability issues, particularly when you have different varying degrees of economic development and also different regimes with respect to the rule of law.
Well, let me just raise a response to that.
Sure.
There's an awful lot of dialogue that goes on about accelerating the growth of the economy, finding new jobs that are sustainable,
Sure.
getting the credit and so on. But there is a lot of talk about it, and I worry about a compact which is so broad that it doesn't end up in any concrete result, you know, where you can say, this is an active imperative for the future. This is creating a situation where housing is going to be built, where credit for, I mean, just for example, and I don't mean to pick on you, but you just raised it all.
Well, you sure
I mean,
are.
for example, I talked about the Middle East Investment Initiative and the creation of jobs through Turkey does the same kind of thing. It's a public-private program, but it's a leasing program instead of hard assets.
Right.
But it's something that you look at and say, well, 99% of the economy of Turkey is SME, small, medium enterprises.
Sure.
And they're getting somewhere because they're doing it this way, through a leasing system that's working. And I'm just wondering, is that something that you support, advance, work with, or am I off base?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that we certainly encourage and talk to those points at a policy level. But also, and this is not to put pressure on the local network, and I point to my colleague Denise, but it's also about dialogue within the local context. What's important to the region in which the local network is operating, and what's important to the companies and SMEs within that local network, and in terms of prioritisation on what they want to focus on. Right. So in terms of the next slide, I'll go through, there's a few issues that highlight that the Global Compact focuses on, but then of course we provide that information and provide that platform for dialogue. But really, I think you can't underestimate the importance of the local networks in making that a reality on the ground. Yeah. So that was a very general answer to your very specific question.
You know, because I got tired of too much talk about the Middle East, and so I adopted a slogan.
What's that?
Which is a very simple one. Do it now.
Yeah.
End the dialogue, end the talk, get to work, get your hands in the dirt,
Sure.
do it now.
And we work with NGOs as well, so, and we also work with other organisations.
I don't mean to pick on you, but you raised the issue.
No, it's highlighting a really good point. No, it's highlighting a really good point. Thank you, Berl.
Yeah, I'm always delighted.
No more questions for you. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So this is, by extension of the architecture. We had our lead companies. So our lead companies are what we would call the elite companies, if you will, of the Global Compact, come together, and we consulted with them to really try and find some prioritisation of issues with respect to how they're going to build those relationships with member states and vice versa. And what they came up with, which I always like to say is quite akin to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but really is focusing on 4 key areas. The first, and at the apex, is inclusive growth, which looks at prosperity and equity. And then you can almost see these as building blocks. So the next level down is human needs and capability. So looking at the importance of education, which I know was raised before. Again, another issue raised before was women's empowerment and gender equality, and also looking at health issues. Then the next level below that is the resource triad, so looking at issues of food and agriculture with population growth is going to be another issue, looking at water and sanitation, and also energy and climate. And finally, really being obviously the topic of today is and also respect for human rights as well, and really does serve as the bedrock for financial, social and environmental development. And just to make a point here as well, in terms of consistency, a lot of these issue areas that were highlighted are already items that we're working on at the Global Compact, and also are in conversations that UN member states are having now. So that is quite encouraging. And just as a sort of convenient aside, this is also consistent, as you can see to the right of the slide, with the definition of corporate sustainability that we have, which is around obviously the financial, social, environmental and ethical considerations. So what is good governance through anti-corruption? You can see a definition there by Ban Ki-moon, and I think we've covered this quite extensively. Another interesting rule of law index was from the World Justice Project that was released earlier this year, and they measure how the rule of law is experienced by everyday citizens. So we can speak to the rule of law as legal professionals in a very esoteric way, and so we really need to distill what that means to everyday people. So the World Justice Project goes out on the ground and asks what's important to them, and one of the categories that they cover is the absence of corruption. And as I think this has also been touched on before, but clearly the existence of corruption in a given state leads its citizens to believe that its government is up for sale, and as a consequence lose trust in its leadership and its institutions, and of course the political system more broadly, which obviously impedes the right to vote as well. In terms of the relevance to business, another interesting survey that just came out recently was the Dow Jones State of Anti-Corruption Compliance, and highlights Juergen's point, which is that 50% of the companies surveyed, circa 383 that were surveyed, advised that they would stop or delay a foray into emerging markets due to corporate-related concerns. So it's a very real, very tangible concern, and obviously carries with it lots of risk if businesses were to engage in a particular region. So just touching on the relevance of the UN Global Compact's involvement is through the 10th principle, which was the last principle that was introduced, and that came through in 2004, which is actually the same time as the UN Convention Against Corruption, and really does reflect an acknowledgement by business in the shared responsibility for the elimination of corruption. An anti-corruption working group was established, and that comprises of chief compliance officers, general counsel, company secretaries, etc. And this was used obviously to define the needs of the business community in aligning and implementing anti-corruption related activity, including but not limited to an action hub where there's a promotion of collaborative engagement and partnership to support multi-stakeholder efforts in eliminating anti-corruption. And that is, we can't overemphasise the importance of there being this race to the top mentality as opposed to a race to the bottom, which unfortunately we have experienced in the past. And also a call to action, an appeal to the private sector, to governments that perhaps have some work to do, to include anti-corruption and good governance in the post-2015 agenda. And it was really great and encouraging to hear Helena's comments as well about Greco, because that's a great example of how states are coming together to address this very issue, so that's excellent. So coming to my particular area of expertise is good governance through business for the rule of law. And again, we've discussed this concept and definition of the rule of law, so I won't go through that again. But I guess more important to emphasise here is that, also just as a reminder, I also have a handout for you on the Business for the Rule of Law initiative that we're working on, so you're welcome to read that at your leisure. But it's important to note here that now more than ever before, it's a really interesting time, but we're hearing legal professionals, academia, even business professionals asking about this concept of the rule of law. So there's a growing realisation that it's essential for sustainable and inclusive economic growth. And it provides the foundation for respecting and supporting human rights, environmental issues, labour rights, and also anti-corruption efforts. And so again, consistent with the 10 principles. But among other things, the rule of law promotes economic investment by lowering levels of corruption, encouraging reducing civil unrest, increasing security of contracts, and also, importantly, allowing for the timely, fair and transparent and predictable resolution of disputes if they arise. Also, the rule of law creates opportunities. So with the expansion of companies' operations into developing and emerging markets, new resources, human capital and consumer markets can also be leveraged.
Could I interrupt again?
Sure.
Drive you crazy. I don't mean to, but I listen to this and then I say, how do you know what the results are when you're going around the globe?
Yeah.
You're dealing with hundreds probably of corporations
Sure.
and individuals,
Sure.
and you don't know if they're doing anything or not. How do we know that this really is going to make a difference as far as bribery, corruption, any of that? I mean, is there any way to measure that?
Sure.
Are you measuring it?
That's an excellent question. I like that question, Berl.
What?
So I like that question. That's a better question. No, it's a good one. So in terms of the extent that we monitor performance, if you will, for want of a better word, we do have a requirement of all of our participants to complete, upon signing up to the Global Compact and becoming participants, on the anniversary of that signing, they are required to submit what is called a communication on progress. So, and that is then required every year thereafter. And effectively what that does is they have to, in the interest of full disclosure, provide an update on how they are addressing the 4 key areas of the Global Compact. Now, that said, we appreciate that companies and SMEs will be at varying levels of development. So we don't expect them to get full marks in these reports. What we want to see is integral change, that there's actually an incremental development over time. And with all due respect, we do have limited resources, so it's not like we do encourage companies to do internal audit, or have an external auditor review the report. But what we do is we do look at things periodically and check to see the quality of those reports.
I have another question. Do you
Sure.
ever look at any of these companies that have signed into the compact and even given in money and realize they're doing very little, and you end up saying, you flunk, you're out of here?
Yes, that's the short answer, absolutely. So we've gone through a cleanse of late, and we're starting to go through more periodic cleanses, if you will, and that has actually resulted in the expulsion of quite a number of companies and small to medium enterprises.
Good. All right.
That answer your question?
Thank you.
Thank you, you're welcome.
I appreciate it. We promised there would be, I don't know how much time we have. Everybody's probably half asleep. What do you think? Okay, we have some questions. Someone stole them. They were given here. I don't know who stole. I think Christina stole them. But we do have some time, and I think it's really important to respond to what may be on your mind at the end of this rather lengthy day. There's been a lot of substance. I've gotten something out of it. I hope you all have. But I hope that you're thinking about it enough. And I don't mean to be as cynical as I may have sounded, but I am. And I just think there is so much that has to be done. There is so much to do with the business community and the opportunities to take risks, because innovation, particularly innovation in the new tech area, is going to, in my judgment, open up vast opportunities for jobs, new employment, new education that can make a huge difference in the world. Otherwise, we literally are going to end up with millions of young people who have given up, are living in despair, and saying disruption is a lot better than the way we're living. That is the worst. Yes. Who? What? Why? Are you finished? I told her I was going to interrupt her, so she's used to it.
Thank you,
Go
Berl.
ahead.
Thank
Finish
you.
it up.
Okay, great.
No, go finish.
Well, this is the best bit. I mean, this is business support for the rule of law, so
Okay.
it's very important. Thank you. Okay, so how can business support the rule of law? So the Secretary General launched, or should I say rather announced, this new initiative, again in September last year, for Business for the Rule of Law, which is an exciting new global initiative around business community and mobilising support for the rule of law. And we're working with LexisNexis and the Atlantic Council, and also in consultation with the UN's Rule of Law Unit, who unfortunately weren't able to be here today, to develop a framework on aiming to build the business case around business support for the rule of law, provide them with some guidance, because they are craving guidance, and also encourage action. So really trying to build a community in terms of action. And this is in particular relevance, of course, in any area, any region in which a business operates. And it's also important to emphasise that this is supposed to work as a complement and not a substitute for government action. And we're really excited because this is actually right in the planning process as we speak. So we're in the process of developing the consultations that will occur through the course of this year in various spots around the world, and also hoping to launch by mid to late 2015. And just to give you a bit of context, we've actually really been encouraged, because we've done some desk research, and as a bit of a disclaimer, we haven't substantiated these examples, but we have been able to extract some examples, circa 50 so far, that really do resonate with us about how they're promoting the rule of law. And just consistent with the way that we define the support for the rule of law is four key areas. So core business activities, strategic social investment and philanthropy, public policy engagement and advocacy, and partnerships and collective action. So the first one you can see there is actually, interestingly, DLA Piper, who assisted the government of Myanmar in order to identify gaps in the rule of law through the drafting of their constitution, and also looking at human rights, international and criminal law. And that was sort of part of their core business activities, if you will. The second one, around strategic social investment and philanthropy, is actually a consumer product, so a cosmetics company in Avon through their foundation. And they donated a significant amount of funds to Cornell University Law School to establish the Global Centre of Women and Justice. And they're working very closely with judges and the legal professionals, governments and NGOs around the world to eliminate gender-based violence and also human trafficking. The third one there, around public policy engagement and advocacy, is something that was managed with LexisNexis, and interestingly was something coming out of the US. So even in developed states, it's really important to reinforce that message around the rule of law. And they did undertook some advocacy efforts on the prevention of and remedies associated with human trafficking, which resulted in the adoption of an act, Uniform Act, to change the lives of human trafficking victims across the US. And finally, this is actually a beverage company from memory, and they were partnered with the government of Cameroon, and including other businesses, which is really important as well, and NGOs, to establish the Business Coalition Against Corruption. So it's really encouraging to see all of these activities already underway. So again, this is another piece, the really important thing that we've noticed as part of the Global Compact, and with due respect to our profession, unfortunately, lawyers were not all that keen to engage with the Global Compact in its early days. But we're finding that over the years, there's been a growing recognition of the critical role that lawyers can play in advancing corporate sustainability and in their business relationships, whether they're private practice or whether they're in-house counsel. And so as a corollary to that, the UN Global Compact has increased its efforts to engage with the legal profession. And again, we've given you another handout and outlining the activities that we have underway. But I think more importantly, to bring your attention to the last two initiatives, the Guide for General Counsel on Corporate Sustainability. So we're working with another major law firm on developing a guide for corporate counsel with respect to corporate sustainability, and that's working at the board level but also at the managerial level, and really reinforcing providing an opportunity, I guess, to highlight, for want of a better phrase, but that lawyers can play an active role and serve as a sort of a conscience of the corporation, if you will, and we hope for them to be able to get more engaged in that space. And finally, something that we're quite interested in exploring at the moment is we've appointed a special advisor to explore the viability of building the capacity of lawyers to play a wider role in advancing corporate sustainability issues and through law schools and continuing legal education. So we really want to be able to empower our future lawyers and also our existing professionals to be able to advance these issues. Great, so just some final comments. Just looking at addressing the fundamentals. It's just important to highlight that economic development really does require social stability, dependable institutions, and above all, the rule of law. And there is a very much a call to action for governments to step up to the plate, if you will, and renew their commitment to the UN and the post-2015 agenda, which at its core depends on the rule of law. And as part of that, the growing realisation that public-private partnerships are critical and what role business can play in that in addressing some of the world's most burgeoning issues so that we can encourage social development and, by extension, economic development. And so, again, highlighting that while, companies may have their own agenda, there is, we want to make sure that they do it in a sustainable way. And just two final points that I'd like to make is how to engage with the Global Compact. So I highlighted the pyramid, which has all of the issues that we're actually currently have underway, and we're already actively engaged in. And we have those, and feel free to visit our website and have a look more at those. But I, again, cannot emphasise enough the importance of the local network, especially here in this context, the global network here in Turkey, and engaging and working with their own participants, which I understand is about 180 participants, in working through these issues with respect to their own priorities. So I thank you for your time, and I hope that was informative.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think we're about done, and I'll look forward to seeing you tonight, tomorrow, whatever it may be, and much gratitude. Thank you.